From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So, good morning, everybody. On behalf of the Librarian of Congress, who could not be with us today, I would like to welcome you all to the Library of Congress. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the African and Middle Eastern Division, and I'm delighted to see so many of you who have worked with us over the years and who are here today. So we are here in celebration of the 60th anniversary of the Program of African Studies at Howard University, the first institution in the United States to offer a doctorate degree in the field of African studies. Historical ties and cooperative undertakings between Africanist scholars and researchers at Howard University and the Library of Congress have a long-standing tradition. For decades, Howard University Africanist scholars and researchers have acknowledged the Library of Congress as one of the major and richest repositories for the study of Africa. It is noteworthy that in 1958, E. Franklin Frazier, professor of sociology and director of the Program of African Studies at Howard, and Dr. Dorothy Wesley Porter, eminent curator and supervisor of the university's prestigious Morland Spinard collection, were instrumental in advocacy efforts and planning for, quote, a national center to acquire, catalog, and preserve library and research materials documenting the history and cultures of the African continent. In 1960, the African section was formally established here at the Library of Congress. The section continues to play a vital role in the library's acquisition program, offers expert reference and bibliographic services to Congress and to an international community of researchers, and maintains liaison with professional associations and research and teaching institutions all over the United States and around the world as well. The section is well known for its bibliographic program, which includes more than 40 bibliographic guides designed to help researchers access the library Africana collections more effectively. A further step in augmenting the growth of the library's Africana collections was the establishment in Nairobi, Kenya, in 1966, of a regional center with responsibility for acquiring current publications in Eastern and Southern Africa. Cultural and scholarly programs and other outreach activities have long been part of the African section's agenda. In 2008, for example, both the Department of African Studies and the Ralph Bunche International Affairs Center at Howard University partnered with the library's African section in sponsoring a symposium commemorating the 50th anniversary of Things Fall Apart, one of the most important literary works to come of Africa by the great literary scholar Chinua Achebe. And we currently have an ongoing program called Conversations with African Poets and Writers that is entering its third year now. We're working with the Africa Society of the National Summit on Africa and with the Poetry Center here. And we have 6 speakers, 3 in the fall and 3 in the spring. And I'd like to invite you to come and attend those. They are readings, interviews, and they go all over the sweep of African literature. The library's Africana collections provides an extraordinary intellectual record for the study of both the historical and contemporary present-day African nations. Holdings cover virtually every major field of study in the social sciences and the humanities, and include an invaluable body of primary source materials in many diverse formats and languages, including materials in African vernacular languages. We have a very significant collection in the vernacular. It is important to note that Howard University Africanist scholars have extended invaluable assistance to specialists in the African section, facilitating a number of professional networks with government officials, librarians, and publishers in the Africa region to support the library's acquisition program. Additionally, Howard scholars have provided expertise to improve bibliographic control of many of our African language resources. At the initiative of Dr. Robert Edgar, new graduate students in Howard's African Studies program have met with African section specialists each semester for more than a decade for briefings on library research on Africa-related topics. From these briefings, the African section has benefited greatly from the support of a number of student volunteers and interns who have witnessed the work of the African section specialists in efforts to promote bibliographic control, preservation, and accessibility of the treasures and resources of the library's Africana collections. Today, the African section salutes Howard University's Department of African Studies and its 6 decades of scholarly achievements. We actually have representative samples of these works from Howard University scholars by Howard University scholars who are there for you to look at later if you wish. We also take this opportunity to say thank you for the continuing institutional support and cooperation that you have provided to advance the Library of Congress African sections and its programs and to promote scholarly research on Africa. Now, the next speaker is Dr. Cham, and before I introduce him, I'd like to thank him and Dr. Angel Batiste, a Howard graduate and a pillar of African studies here at the library. Together, Dr. Cham and Dr. Batiste organized and made possible the event today. And now let me introduce very briefly Dr. Cham. He is a professor and chair of the Department of African Studies at Howard University. Dr. Cham has received numerous awards from Howard University, including the Howard University Fund for Academic Excellence Travel Award. He has also served as a jury member for prestigious review panels and awards both within and outside Howard University. These include the Paul Robeson Film Awards, Prize Pieces Film and Video Competition, and the annual Rosebud Awards and Competition. Dr. Cham has also presided on the jury on short film competition of the 16th FESPACO Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso 1999, and the feature films and video features jury in Southern Africa Film Festival, Harare, Zimbabwe, 1998. And he has served as a consultant to UNESCO and the World Bank. So, Dr. Cham, I pass on the baton to you.
Good morning. Thank you for those kind words, Dr. Dib. I bring you greetings from Howard University, especially from our deans, Dean Badigashian, Interim Dean, College of Arts and Sciences, and Dean Gary Harris, who is also the Interim Dean of the Graduate School, who were not able to be here with us today. But they do send their warm greetings to all of you. Thank you, Dr. Dib, for hosting this particular event here. We're very honored, and thank you very much, Angel, for taking the initiative actually to propose that in support of the series of events that we've been putting up the whole year, that we also have a session here at the Library of Congress, given the important role historically that, as Dr. Dib has just pointed out, Howard scholars have played in enabling developing the collection here at the Library of Congress. Actually, I was browsing through Rayford Logan's prodigious history of Howard just recently, and he relates some kind of an inside joke or inside anecdote at Howard at the time, where Howard scholars had such a massive, thick, and influential presence in one of the federal government agencies. I mean, Howard Scholars were going there constantly. They were being called upon constantly to go and give lectures related to Africa, to the diaspora, and all of those other issues there. That Logan says that, Howard Scholars started calling that particular department of the U.S. government an extension department of Howard University. Now, I think it would be hyperbolic or an exaggeration to say that, the Africa section here is an extension of Howard University. But I think that metaphor really captures the sort of umbilical ties, that have brought together Howard University and the Africa section here. And as Dr. Dib has also pointed out, we are very proud that some of our alumni have been very much a presence in the Africa section of the Africa and Middle Eastern Division here at the Library of Congress. I can go through the names there. There's Angel Batiste here. Fantahon Turune is not here, is he? Yeah, he's probably on his way here. I think Laverne also. So. Exactly. So, well, I guess for our purpose today, we can say that it's an extension of an extension department of Howard University. This is a very exciting moment for us, celebrating 60 years of the graduate program in African Studies at Howard University. But I think if you take a long view, you'll see that the formal establishment of the graduate program in 1953 was really a step to institutionalize, to formalize what has always been a part, in fact, the DNA of Howard University since its inception, the study of Africa and people of African descent throughout the world. So, excuse me, we are glad that we're able to be here today to celebrate this moment here, and to also take pride in the fact that if you look at institutions all around the world, I think Howard stands out, not just in terms of being a pioneer in the field, but also in terms of institutionalizing and consistently over the years supporting the study of Africa and the African diaspora institutionally. And it is one of those institutions that don't depend on outside funding, grants to maintain these programs, as is the case in many other universities. But these are hard institutional monies that have been invested in the study and promotion of this particular area of study of discipline. And we're very proud to be here to celebrate that particular moment, 60 years of this institution. So I want to thank all of you for coming and supporting us, and also to thank my colleagues who responded enthusiastically when we reached out to them to be part of this moment here. And Dr. Batiste will be introducing them in more detail in a moment. So I want to thank all of you again and welcome you on behalf of all the authorities at Howard University. And again, thank you, Dr. Deeb, for hosting us here. We're very delighted. Thank you. Asante.
I too welcome all of you to the Library of Congress. As an alumni of the Howard University Department of African Studies, I am extremely pleased to salute the department in celebrating a momentous milestone. 6 decades of training African specialists and elevating African studies scholarship. My sincere appreciation goes to our distinguished faculty, Dr. Nyang, Dr. Carr, Dr. Dodson, and Dr. Edgar. I'd like to note that this program is being webcast, and it will be accessible to an international audience on the African and Middle Eastern Division website. It will also be preserved in the library's digital Africana collections. We will be having a break at about 11:15 at this point, and I urge all of you to take a look at the scholarship that has been produced by the faculty of Howard University, the Africanist faculty, and we will also take that time to have coffee and tea. African studies at Howard is rooted in the Pan-African consciousness of an impressive list of prominent Howard University faculty, including Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and Dr. Charles Wesley, the acknowledged architect of the field of African studies. Adding to this list, we include Professors Ralph Bunch, E. Franklin Frazier, Alain Locke, Kelly Miller, Rayford Logan, Frank Snowden, John Hope Franklin, Chancellor Williams, Lorenzo Turner Dow, Joseph Harris, Joseph Applegate, and importantly, the renowned bibliographer, Dr. Dorothy Wesley Porter. The establishment of the African Studies and Research Program at Howard in 1953 and the launching of the nation's first doctoral program in African Studies in 1969 symbolically represents the vision and the relentless efforts of these pioneer Africanist scholars. Today, the Howard University Department of African Studies offers both undergraduate and graduate degrees, and African courses are dispersed throughout the curriculum of the university's discipline-based and professional degree programs. Before we lead into our discussion, I would like to introduce our guest panelists, who will provide a broader insight into the intellectual tradition of African studies at Howard University. Dr. Greg Carr is the Associate Professor of Africana Studies and Chair of Afroamerican Studies at Howard University, and adjunct faculty at the Howard University School of Law. The School District of Philadelphia's first resident scholar on race and culture, Dr. Carr led a team of academics and educators in the design of the curriculum for Philadelphia's mandatory high school African American history course. Dr. Carr is the first vice president of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization. He is co-editor of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations multi-volume African World History Project. It's Dr. Carr here. Dr. Dodson, to my right, is the director of the Morland Spinard Research Center in Howard University's libraries. A national leader in the movement to preserve African American history, he was formerly chief of the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the world's leading repository for materials on Black cultural life. Dr. Dodson served as chair of the Federal Steering Committee for the African Burial Ground and was a member of the President's Commission on the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He also serves on the Scientific and Technical Committee of the UNESCO Slave Route Project. And Dr. Robert Edgar. Dr. Robert Edgar is a professor of African Studies at Howard University. His areas of teaching and research include African history, Southern African history, African Religions and Political Movements, and Social Science Research Methods. He has served as visiting faculty at universities in the United States and in Lesotho, and has received numerous awards, including the Howard University Faculty Research Award and a 3-year grant from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission for a documentary editing project on African American historical linkages with South Africa from 1890 to 1965. And last but not least, Dr. Sulayman Nyang is Professor of African Studies at Howard University. From 1986 through 1993, Dr. Nyang served as the chair of the Department of African Studies. He has served as Deputy Ambassador of the Republic of Gambia to Saudi Arabia and 7 other North African and Middle Eastern countries. Dr. Nyang was the founding editor of the American Journal of Islamic Studies, now known as the American Journal of Islamic Social Sciences. He was also the president of the Association of Muslim Social Scientists. Dr. Nyang has served as consultant to several national and international agencies and on the boards of the African Studies Association, the American Council for the Study of Islamic Societies, and the American Islamic Heritage Museum. He was an advising scholar for the award-winning PBS broadcast documentaries Muhammad, Legacy of a Prophet, and Prince Among Slaves, produced by Unity Productions Foundation. Our discussion format today will, I'm sorry. I'm anxious to get to our speakers. Our discussion format today will include 2 sessions. Our first session will be approximately an hour, and I'll be asking our guest panelists to try to limit their presentations to 20 minutes. As a Howardite, I know that can be a bit difficult, but if we could try to limit the discussions to 20 minutes, and following each session, we will have a Q&A. For those who participate in our question and answer, I'd like to note that today's program is being webcast, and by submitting a question, you are agreeing to be a part of our webcast production. After our first hour, we'll be breaking up. Let's say we're running into 10:30 now. About 11:30, we'll break up for a brief coffee and tea break and a view of some of our exhibit items. And I'd like to ask that for those with coffee and tea, if you can stay away from the Africana treasures. So our first panel session will include Dr. Dodson and Dr. Edgar. And Dr. Dodson will be our first speaker. I turn the podium over to Dr. Dodson.
Well, thank you very much. And let me also, on behalf of Howard University Libraries and the Morland Spinard Research Center staff, congratulate the African Studies Department on its 60th anniversary. We share a lot of history together and look forward to sharing more. I had, when I was asked to do this, I had a lot of, some levels, fear and trepidation being asked to talk about this topic, because I don't claim to be a historian of Howard University, and I don't claim to be an Africanist, though I study African and African diaspora experience as a central part of my own academic and intellectual interest. I've been at Howard now for a little more than about a year and a half, and in my efforts to develop a rational 21st century library program that is aligned with Howard's teaching, research, and learning mission, I've been obliged to delve into its history. Some of the impetus for this particular line of inquiry has been in search of insights into contemporary policies, programs, and academic practices. And most intriguing for me has been questions related to the origin and development of Howard's Morland Spinard Research Center. There are a few, I guess, official histories that have been written, but I've found a lot of questions unanswered in them, and so I've been probing around trying to get some sense of that. And the reason for this, in part, is because Morland Spinard will celebrate its 100th anniversary next year. And so behind these questions have been what appears to me to have been Howard's seemingly at times ambivalent relationship to the study of the Black experience. And I say that knowing that Dr. Cham has already said that it's been there for all of its history, but I'm going to raise some questions about that, I suspect. This ambivalence has seemingly been a part of Howard's founding creed, and while Howard has been a national leader in the study of the Black experience, especially since the 1920s, and while Howard boasts of one of the largest and most distinguished faculties specializing in the study of the Black experience in any American university, institutionally, as I look at it, Howard has been seemingly more committed to advancing its role as a center for educating and training Black leadership than it has been committed to the establishment of itself in an organic way, an institutional way, as the leading intellectual authority on the study of the global Black experience. This is not to suggest that individual faculty members and indeed some departments, schools, and colleges have not played such leadership roles in the past, nor do I mean to say that individual faculty members in departments and schools are not playing such intellectual leadership roles today, or that they are not engaged in the struggle for intellectual hegemony in these fields. What I do want to suggest is that while Howard pioneered in the development of many of the disciplines and subfields of African and African diaspora experience, Howard as an institution has not maintained that leadership position in many of these areas. And I would like to suggest that ironically, institutionally, Howard's ambivalence about placing teaching and research on the Black experience at the core of its mission is one of the sources of that. There's also institutional ambivalence about the values of study and research. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The charter of Howard University establishes Howard as a university for the education of youth in liberal arts and sciences. And that's in quotes, the education of youth in the liberal arts and sciences. Now, General O. Howard, the founder of the school, was committed to making Howard an integrated institution, so the charter language avoided specifying a mission that was singularly focused on Black people. The project was funded by the Freedmen's Bureau, and whose express purpose was to prepare the formerly enslaved Black population for citizenship and productive economic, political, and social lives as free people. Now, actually, Howard wasn't the only one of the schools that was funded by the Freedmen's Bureau. Indeed, some 21, including Howard, received funding to support the educational development of Black folk. For reasons that are not altogether clear to me, Howard left the door open to non-Blacks, especially non-Black women. The first students enrolled at Howard were not Black. They were 4 white women, daughters of the founders, who ultimately aspired to get to legal careers. And if you know anything about that period of time, women were not admitted to law schools in the country. And so as we cut through the chase, and I'm afraid to get into this because it's not, anyway, as you, as you cut to the chase, the school was actually founded to fund both of those And it's the way the language was written was to make sure that that second option could in fact be carried out. Now, what is significant for our purposes today is that while the mission, and I should say, and this is the women actually did matriculate in the law school, and well into the 1990s were still matriculating, but they made a decision that they needed to get away from men, and so they moved and set up their own independent women's law school, and no blacks were admitted, but that's another story. What is significant for our purpose today is that while the mission of the university was to educate black folk, there were no provisions for teaching them about themselves, about their African origins and cultures, of their experiences as enslaved Africans in the United States or throughout the Americas. There are likely at least two reasons for this oversight. The first one, the reigning unwisdom of the 19th century and before, was that black people had no history and culture. And this myth was part of the ideological justification for slavery and for colonialism. And in the minds of most Europeans, at least, Africans were pagans, savages, devoid of civilization or any history. And hence, there was nothing really to teach them about themselves. Ironically, and there was this notion, too, that the history of black folk, you couldn't teach it because there wasn't enough information to say anything about them anyway. Now, ironically, as late as the 1960s and early 70s, variations on this theme were being raised to question the intellectual viability of establishing black studies programs. So almost 100 years after Howard is around, they're still raising questions about whether or not there's this field of the study of black folk has intellectual viability. The Congregational missionaries who founded Howard, like their abolitionist brothers and sisters, were opposed to slavery and to racial oppression. They did not, however, embrace the notion that Africans or the formerly enslaved freedmen were or ever could become equal to whites in racial and intellectual terms. Moreover, the concept of education that the founders brought to their missionary enterprise also precluded any serious intellectual engagement with the histories and cultures of the human beings they proposed to educate. And so, as it's been the case in missionary enterprises on the African continent and in Asia and other parts of the world, the educational function in missionary enterprises was, in fact, to civilize the natives, to pass on the knowledge and civilization that Europeans had to them, rather than to try to tell them anything about themselves or help them learn anything about themselves. So that's a kind of context in which we ask ourselves and have to ask ourselves, where do we begin to find some space at Howard for teaching and studying and researching the histories and heritage of people of African descent? Now, since the first decade of the 20th century, Howard has been pridefully referred to as the capstone of Negro education. This reference derived from Howard's status as the largest and most comprehensive of the colleges and universities that primarily served African Americans and other people of African descent. Established to provide, as I said before, an education for youth in the liberal arts and sciences, Howard successfully defended and affirmed the value of liberal arts education for blacks and fended off efforts to displace it with industrial education. The struggle between the two educational philosophies was carried out in many tangible ways on Howard's campus itself. And I'll just mention this very briefly. Booker T. Washington was invited to serve on the board of Howard University in 1907. And he joined the board in 1907 along with a gentleman by the name of Jesse Morland. Booker T and Morland's appointment to the board signaled to some people that this was a move to start to transition Howard to the industrial model of education. And the president at the time, President Durkee, was frankly trying to find some way of balancing both, but in all honesty, the reason why he was inviting the two of them onto the board was he was trying to figure out how to get some of the white philanthropy money. Okay? And so he ends up catching a lot of heat, quite frankly, because of that. But that, as they moved on to the board, there were discussions about strengthening the industrial program. Howard had an industrial program in the curriculum, but it was not at the core of the curriculum. At the core of it was this classical education. Anyway, for much of the 19th and early 20th century, the struggle to determine the best or most appropriate educational philosophy for blacks, as well as in the United States, as well as Africa and the Caribbean, shaped African American and African political discourse and educational philosophy. It also, in my judgment, delimited it, for largely unasked and unanswered was what was the place of the study of the history and culture of people of African descent in the classical or the industrial curriculum. Howard's classical liberal arts curriculum had been modeled on that of the schools where its founders graduated, Princeton, Yale, Dartmouth, Bowdoin, etc. Well into the first decade of the 20th century, the classics, including Latin, Greek, and mathematics, dominated and really shaped the curriculum at Howard. It's firmly believed that the study of the classics had a civilizing impact on black students. And mastery of these subjects by blacks, mastery of math, mastery of Greek, mastery of Latin, was also viewed as evidence that black folk, quite frankly, could learn as well as white folk could. To those who doubted the viability or utility of teaching blacks the classics, the quality of Howard University graduates was proof positive that classical education itself was and could be transformative. And in an evolving intellectual center like Howard, whose mission was to produce leaders of the race, there was little or no place for industrial education, and even though, as I mentioned, there was an industrial department. Now, the myth of black racial inferiority and white superiority had been carried over from the slavery era. So had public intellectual assaults on the identity and character and humanity of black people. The black press, as you know, which had been founded to defend blacks against these kind of assaults in 1821, had found a redoubled effort in the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction period in northern and southern newspapers. These assaults on both the dignity and humanity of black folk were buttressed by Darwinian social thought and a new breed of pseudoscientific apologists for racial supremacy in the academy. It was also buttressed by what we saw on the Broadway stage and in advertising in public media and in the film medium. White and academic, and indeed some black academic authorities on the, quotes, Negro problem, end quotes, populated scholarly and public journals and periodicals with new so-called scholarship proving that the myth of black social inferiority and racial inferiority was true. Now, some black colleges, including Hampton and Tuskegee and Atlanta University, started to engage intellectually in trying to defend or use scholarship to advance the condition of the race. Howard did not provide a comparable platform for black intellectuals to apply their intellectual talents to the study and solution of problems affecting the future development of black folk. This did not begin to happen in an institutional sense, quite frankly, until after 1926, when Mordecai Johnson became the first African-American president of Howard University. But prior to 1926, there was a gentleman by the name of Kelly Miller who was the leading proponent of a significant black intellectual leadership position and agenda at Howard. Significantly, Kelly Miller began positioning himself for this role in 1897, the same year that Du Bois had actually assumed the directorship of the Atlanta University Studies project in Atlanta. Miller was a native of Winsboro, South Carolina. Am I running tight on time? I may have to skip a little bit of this. I'll skip a little bit of his background, but Miller enrolled at Howard at the age of 15. No, he was awarded a scholarship at Howard at the age of 15 in 1880. He completed his 3-year program in 2 years and earned a BA in liberal studies from Howard in 1886. That same year, he purchased a 200-acre farm for his family as a graduation gift to them. We don't get that anymore. A year later, he enrolled at Johns Hopkins University, the first African American to enroll in a PhD program there. He spent 2 years there studying mathematics and physics, but ran out of money, and in 1889 left the university to pursue employment. He spent a year at DC's elite black M Street Dunbar High School, and at the conclusion of which he was appointed the first alumni professor of mathematics of Howard University in 1890. Now, that title is important because the alumni actually raised the money to fund the position, which they weren't able to continue to sustain it, and the university eventually took it on as a part of its payroll. But that they took that initiative and raised the money to do that is something quite extraordinary. Miller never returned to Johns Hopkins, but he did earn an AM degree from Howard in 1891 and an LLD in 1903. Now, Miller was of humble background. As I mentioned, he was from South Carolina. He just decided he needed to get some education. And significantly, in the context of Howard, Kelly Miller was a black man, a dark-skinned black man. He was not your typical Howard University black faculty member in the late 19th century. The majority of both black faculty members and members of Howard's administration and board of trustees had been drawn from the black community's mulatto elite group. And Miller's intellectual brilliance and his aggressive commitment to defending and advancing the interests of black people endeared him to America's black intellectual elite, as well as to the black masses as a whole. A powerful lecturer and prolific writer and journalist, he was a much sought-after speaker and activist for the race. He was, in the language of the 19th century, a race man par excellence. He was an invited speaker, just by way of example, at one of Du Bois's earliest Atlanta University Studies conferences. And he regularly published articles on issues affecting black people in black newspapers, et cetera. Certainly the strongest testimony of his intellectual gravitas is the fact that he was one of the 2 young intellectuals selected by the Dean of 19th century black intellectuals, Alexander Crummell, to plan and found the American Negro Academy, the first major black American learned society in 1897. Equally significant is the fact that his solid critique of Frederick Hoffman's pernicious book, Race Traits and Tendencies of the American Negroes, was the first critical scholarly paper published by the Academy. And keep in mind that at the meeting where he presented his paper, W.B. Du Bois, Francis Grimke, and Crummell all presented, and his was chosen as the first one to be published. This is a man of a giant intellect and incredible commitment and passion, who had been schooled and had been actually working actively through the American Negro Academy to start to challenge the myths of black racial inferiority, et cetera, in the Academy. Miller, though, saw this kind of activity as things that should be going on at Howard University. And so he started to try to bring, quite frankly, the academy into Howard. He made proposals to the board and to the president to have the academy meet, establish Howard as its regular meeting place. He tried to get the academy was trying to set up a library, and he tried to get the university to establish the library there at Howard. And he tried on numerous occasions to have the academy become a formal part of Howard University. And the Board of Trustees rejected it over all three of those initiatives. At any rate, he didn't stop. And during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Miller either initiated or was centrally involved in virtually every initiative to promote the study of the Black experience at Howard. In Jesse Morland, a Howard alumnus who was elected to the Board of Trustees along with Washington, as I mentioned, Miller found a powerful and resourceful collaborator. Both Washington and Morland had been viewed with suspicion when appointed because of their relationship to each other and the world of white philanthropy. Morland was believed to have been recruited to help Washington turn Howard into an industrial school, but a brief review of Morland's background would have made it clear where his intellectual allegiances lay. Morland graduated from the theological department of Howard as the salutatorian in 1891. He was ordained a congregational minister and combined a career as congregational minister and secretary of the colored YMCA of Washington, D.C. for several years. He eventually rose to become the national secretary of the colored YMCA organization. And this is important. The 12th Street YMCA building that's up at 12th, I think at R, or thereabouts. That building was built by, or the funds were raised and the building was built by Morland. Not only that, he raised the money and built similar buildings for the colored YMCAs in 19 different cities across the country. And over that period of time that he was working, actually raised over $2 million, which is, each of those buildings cost about $100,000. And he raised the money and got the buildings built all over the country. That's Jesse Morland. Morland was widely read in English and American literature and history and geography and current social and political affairs. He was also a passionate bibliophile who had amassed a large collection on the Black experience. A liberation theologian before his time, Morland's concept of proper ministerial work was that one should be working to help their parishioners own their own homes, take proper care of their children, and become community leaders capable of lifting the burdens of the poor. He pursued this kind of practical ministry until 1898, before he became the head of the colored men's department. Unlike his trustee peers, and I'm almost there. Unlike his trustee peers, I'm almost there. Unlike his trustee peers, Morland believed that Howard had a distinctive intellectual role to play in African and African American studies, especially in the fields of history and sociology. And early in his tenure, he supported Kelly Miller's efforts to house the ANA on campus and publish its research findings. He also supported Alain Locke's proposal to offer a course on race relations, believing, like Miller and Locke, that instruction and research on the African and African Americans should be encouraged by the board. When those efforts failed to jumpstart the university's formal entry into these fields more than 40 years after its founding, Morland decided to take the next step, which was to donate his extensive collection on the Black experiences to Howard in 1914. Kelly Miller had been encouraging him to do so for a long time, and it's a part of his larger vision for Howard. Miller's own vision was that Howard should establish a national Negro library and museum on the campus, and that that should be the foundation on which the whole global study of the African diaspora experience should take place. Miller campaigned with the institution off and on to get this kind of an institution on campus. But when Morland donated his collection to the university, he said, and I quote, he did so because Howard is the one place in America where the largest and best library on the subject of Black history and culture should be constructively established. That was in quotes. His gift established the Morland Foundation, the first research library in an American university devoted exclusively to documenting the Black experience. He continued to donate materials to the collection and support it financially, and in many respects, the acquisition of the Morland collection was the first substantive commitment by the university to the study of the Black experience. Morland was also supported the development of courses and research in Howard's history department. He was responsible for the addition of Carter G. Woodson to the staff in 1919 and William Leo Hansberry in 1922. Though Woodson would only stay for a year, he managed to plan and launch a graduate program in history and supervised the department's first master's degree. Hansberry, on the other hand, would establish the African Civilization section of the history department in 1922. And within 2 years, he was offering 3 courses to more than 800 students on an elective basis annually. A year later, 1925, Hansberry's section sponsored a symposium on the cultures and civilizations of Negro peoples in Africa that featured 28 scholarly papers by his students. His research and teaching activities at Howard would establish him as the real father of African studies in the United States. And it was Morland's hope that the research and instructional programs in Howard's history department would take advantage of the resources of his collection and make Howard the national center for the study of the global Black experience.
Thank you, Dr. Dodson. As you can see, our time format is not working for us. But again, I'm from Howard University, and I know I will have to say this. We are a bit off schedule. I only have this room until 1 o'clock. So we must keep that as our deadline. At this point, Dr. Edgar.
Well, thank you, Angel. I'll try to keep my comments succinct. First, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of so many of our former students and present students in African Studies at Howard University. The Library of Congress has been a real treasure for many of them over the years. I think it was about 20 years ago that we actually started bringing our graduate students to the Library of Congress for orientations on the enormous resources that this library has on Africa. And so your Africa section has graciously hosted our students. Dr. Tom Mann in the reference section has also done orientations, and so this has really become a second home for many of our students. They spend many hours here, so we appreciate this occasion for hosting this event. Today I'd like to focus my remarks on one of the early Africanists at Howard University. We talk about the 60 years that we're celebrating of our African Studies program. But the study of Africa at Howard goes back, of course, many decades before that. Africa really is part of Howard's DNA. But as Dr. Dodson pointed out, it hasn't always been received that way at Howard. And so it's been a struggle over the decades to establish Africa on the campus. And it was not only a struggle on the campus, but it was also a struggle in dealing with the larger society. And in particular, foundations, the various gatekeepers of African studies around the United States. And so if one was at Howard and you wanted to work on Africa, you had to navigate a very tricky field in terms of establishing yourself and getting access to the continent. So I'm going to be focusing on Ralph Bunche. He's a person that I've long had an interest in, and partly because we shared a lot of similarities. We're both graduates of UCLA. Our first faculty positions were at Howard University. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950. I received the they told me it's in the mail. At any rate, Bunche is someone who's fascinated me for a long time, and I produced a book about him and a segment of his journey at Howard in which he was able to travel around the world, and I'll talk about that a bit later. Now first, a little bit of background on Bunche, and then I want to talk about his transition into becoming an expert on international affairs and his baptism really into African affairs. Bunche was born in 1904 in Detroit. He eventually spends most of his youth growing up in Los Angeles, goes to UCLA in the early 1920s. He's a star athlete, but he's also a star student, and he graduates the top of his class. After he leaves UCLA, he goes to Harvard University for an MA degree. And there he produces an MA thesis on a 17th century English political philosopher, Robert Filmer. Now I stress this because none of us know who Robert Filmer was, but the point is Bunche was off in a very different direction, political philosophy. But in 1928, he's invited by Mordecai Johnson, the first black president of Howard, who had come to Howard in 1926, to become the chair and really the founder of the political science department at Howard. So in 1928, Bunche arrives at Howard University, and as Dr. Dodson used this term, Bunche saw himself very much as a race man, someone who was going to actively work for the race and for the betterment of the race. And so, always as part of Bunche's agenda, he was dealing with not only doing academic work, but also political activism. Those two components were always part of his life. So he spent about 3 years at Howard University, starting the political science department, also working considerably for Mordecai Johnson in the president's office. And for those of us who have been at Howard for a long time, we know, the administrative duties that we're called upon to do take up a considerable amount of time, and that's going to become a source of concern for Bunche over the years. But among his colleagues during that time were people like Abram Harris, E. Franklin Frazier, Alain Locke, Doxy Wilkerson, Emmett Dorsey, Dorothy Porter, Alphaeus Hunton, Rayford Logan, Leo Hansberry, Charles Wesley, you can go on and on. And some of these folk had an interest in Africa. But the key thing about them was that all of them had an interest in international affairs, And there was a real tradition at Howard of people traveling to Europe especially to do further studies, either advancing their degrees or doing research on various issues related to the black world. And so during his first stint at Howard, Bunch was very much exposed to international ideas, international studies. And so in the early 30s, when he decides to go back to Harvard for a PhD, he's very keen on doing a topic that is going to have international issues in it, and he especially wants to deal with Africa. Now, of course, his idea of doing something about Africa is not well received. It's not well received by the funders of his fellowship at Harvard, the Rosenwald Foundation. Dr. Embry, who was the head of the foundation, advised Bunch instead to do a study on West Virginia politics. And it's interesting how Bunch responded to that. And here's a quote from Bunch in a letter he sent back to Embry. He said, "I am fully persuaded that the Negro of all scholars must first develop a broad international background if his contribution to the solution of our own domestic problems is to make much impress." So he very much sees becoming well-versed in international issues an important component of his education and for the advancement of black people. Now, Bunch also found resistance to his idea of studying Africa from President Mordecai Johnson at Howard. At one faculty meeting of all the Howard faculty, President Johnson got up and said, "Bunch is going all the way to Africa to find a problem." Now, President Johnson could be quite sarcastic, and I think he was very sincere in his sarcasm. But he was certainly not sympathetic to what Bunch was doing. Now, it's interesting, about that same time in 1932, when Bunch was contemplating doing his dissertation on an African topic, Leo Hansberry was also wanting to go to Egypt. And Hansberry wanted to become a part of an archaeological team, a British archaeological team in Egypt. And he sent a letter to an official at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts inquiring about whether he would be well received by this archaeological team. And this is the letter that he received back from this official at the Boston Museum. He said, "To be perfectly frank with you, if I were in charge of such an expedition, I should hesitate long before taking an American Negro on my staff. I should fear that the mere fact of your being a member of the staff would seriously affect the prestige of the other members and the respect which the native employees would have for them." Now you can see there's a bit of an obstacle here. And by the way, I see Professor Hansberry's daughter in the audience, and shows she knows very much this kind of history. So in other words, there was a real resistance to African Americans doing work on Africa, and the foundations generally would not fund any African American going to Africa until the 1950s, and that's when Professor Hansberry was able to get a Fulbright to go to Africa. Am I correct? Yeah, good. Okay. Now, Bunch's idea of working on Africa also was not well received generally by the Harvard faculty. There was an expert on colonial Africa, Raymond Buell, that became one of his sponsors, patrons. And it's interesting, Bunch learned that game very early on. And I'm looking at my students now. This is something that you should be learning as well, and that is, in negotiating your way through academic life, you've got to find patrons who are going to support you and help you navigate the road of getting funding and so forth for your projects. But eventually Bunch prevailed. He was very hard-headed on this. And he eventually produced a dissertation on the French colonies, studying the comparison between a former League of Nations, a League of Nations mandate that was run by the French in Togoland and Dahomey. And it was actually a brilliant dissertation. If one reads it now, it still holds great value. Now, the thing that distinguished Bunch about this research on Africa was that he was able to get the funding not only to go to Europe for his research, but he also was able to spend 3 months in the territories that he was studying. And so this was very important for him in terms of opening up his outlook, his exposure to Africa, because most Americans who worked on Africa, who wrote on Africa, never went to Africa. And so Bunch was very distinct among all American academics in actually going to the continent for a period of time to do his research. And they really established 3 hallmarks of his approach to research and his research on Africa. First of all, creating knowledge through empirical data. Secondly, studying race as a global problem. And finally, the critical importance of fieldwork for validating knowledge about Africa. So he's very much concerned about having on-the-ground experiences on the continent. So eventually he produced his dissertation in 1934. It was a very quick write-up. It took him about a year to produce. And he was the first African-American to be awarded a PhD in political science. So he returns to Howard after finishing his dissertation, once again resumes his work in the political science department and his work for President Johnson. But he still has this fascination of going to Africa again. So he begins plotting out a way of getting the funding so he can go back and do research. And what he wants to do this time is to do a study on Africa from the ground up. He had done his dissertation on Africa from the top down, from the colonial policies and what their effect was on Africans, but this time he wanted to do a study on Africa from the ground up. He became very active on the Howard campus and organizing conferences on African affairs or international affairs. There was a notable conference in the mid-1930s on world imperialism dealing with Africa and Asia that was hosted by Bunch and others in the social sciences at Howard. I've often wondered where those papers are in the Morland Spinard room, but I haven't been able to find them yet. But they're there. Okay, well, good. The keeper of the papers. But Bunch was also growing weary of his administrative duties at Howard, and he longed for a way of escaping them. And so in the mid-1930s, he makes a proposal to the Social Science Research Council. And it is along the lines that he would like to do the study of Africa from the ground up. And he receives a negative response from the foundation. They are not really interested in doing that. But Bunch has a patron, and a very important patron, Melville Herskovits. Now, Herskovits had spent a year at Howard in the mid-1920s, and he had become quite a notable anthropologist in the time that time and afterwards. But he had a strong affinity for people working at Howard. And so he came to Bunch's rescue and proposed to the SSRC that Bunch be given a fellowship to study anthropological field methods in various parts of the world. Now, this is something that floors me. It floored me when I was doing my research. It floored me even now. They gave Bunch 2 years of support and told him that you could take a round-the-world trip and you could sort of decide where you would go and what you would study. And so Bunch, like any of us academics, jumped at that opportunity to do that. And so in 1936, he sets off, actually 1937, he sets off in this round-the-world trip. And part of it is to study anthropology with the doyens of anthropology at Northwestern, Herskovits, Malinowski at the London School of Economics, and Isaac Shapira at the University of Cape Town. And on that trip, he's able to go to London for a period of time. His Swahili teacher there is Jomo Kenyatta. He goes to South Africa for 3 months. That's what my book is based on, his research notes from that. And without going into the details of that, I'll leave you the book to introduce you to that. He has a really extraordinary time traveling around the country. People are not quite sure what to make of him because he's a very light-skinned black person. They don't know if he's Filipino, if he's Egyptian. They are not quite sure how to regard him or define him. But his research notes that he kept on that trip are just fascinating reading about South Africa in 1937. He then goes on to East Africa for 5 months and spends that time studying African societies, especially the Kikuyu in Kenya. Eventually he comes back to Howard, and I think many of you are probably familiar with his story after that. And I think one of the fascinating things about Bunch is that even though he gets pulled into other activities, the Myrdal Report is one of its key researchers, then into the United Nations, in the Trusteeship Council, a mediator in the Middle East for which he wins the Nobel Prize. He still maintains his interest in Africa. It's a shame that he was never able to write the book he was planning to write on his travels in Africa in the late 1930s. But I hope what my comments today have signified is that in order to become an Africanist at Howard or in the United States, especially an African-American Africanist, one had to jump through a lot of hurdles, a lot of obstacles to do that. And so as we look back upon African studies at Howard today, we should be very cognizant of the fact of all the struggles that have gone on before and that actually go on now in terms of making sure that the field is sustained on our campus. Thank you very much. Good. Get the time right.
Unfortunately, Dr. Edgar had to leave us for an appointment this afternoon. But we'll continue into our second session with our speakers. And starting off this session will be Dr. Carr. Dr. Carr chairs the Afroamerican Studies, or the African American Studies Department at Howard University.
Thank you, Dr. Batiste. And I want to thank the organizers, and thank you, Dr. Cham, for the invitation, and thank the Department of African Studies. And also, I'm grateful to be in this conversation with my friend Dr. Dodson and Dr. Cham, who's going to clean up all the unanswered questions when I get finished stumbling through this and adding a little bit more chaos to the conversation. It's always nice to be in what began as Mr. Jefferson's library. always nice to be here, because it reinforces the idea that the Negro is not part of this conversation. I like to sit in the room, in the greeting room, and look up in the air and see the Egyptians as white and all the beautiful, I guess the apotheosis of George Washington's across the street in the Capitol Rotunda. But when you look up in the rotunda at the Library of Congress, it reinforces, it's almost like the Catholic or even the Anglican tradition in Christianity, it reinforces your worthlessness. And so the aspiration is to become part of this conversation. And in many ways, I think this conversation about African studies at Howard, which is really the insurgent movement in the field, is a conversation about not particularly wanting to be in the conversation, but the conversation that, and the ambivalence about even that position. And that's something that Dr. Dodson has laid out. So I don't have to plow that field. You already plowed it up real good. No, that's important because, I mean, Howard politics are no different than the university politics anywhere else, which means that they are as small bore and as petty as any other institution. And in some ways, I think my remarks, which I had titled African Studies, Afro-American Studies, and the Study of the African Diaspora at Howard University on Translation, Recovery, and Disciplinarity, I could perhaps throw that title out and perhaps call this The Evasion of William Leo Hansberry. Because the way I understand it, when Dr. Franklin, good to see you, brother. When the Ford Foundation decided to give some money to African studies, they damn near didn't give Howard anything. And they didn't give Roosevelt anything, because St. Clair Drake and them was there. By the time I think Lorenzo Del Turner was there with him. But William Leo Hansberry was cut out of that conversation. E. Franklin Frazier was seen as a more dependable kind of Negro to keep Howard in line in what was emerging as a Cold War discourse. African studies being hatched as an idea where white folks kind of keep an eye on these Negroes and hope they didn't run off to the Russians or the Chinese. And Howard had to convince philanthropy that they would not be insurgents. Now that's important to understand. I think it's important to understand, particularly given the context of the mid-1950s, because what you begin to see is what Gerald Horne calls a truce in some ways. What is the truce? The truce is the ruling elite in this country, political elite and economic elite, particularly political elite, trying to make a truce with an emerging black middle class that in exchange for some concessions on kind of social dalliances, not dalliances, social accommodations, you need to turn away from linking internationally in any way that can unsettle the existing political dynamic in the world, certainly the post-World War II dynamic. China's got its own problems. Mao Zedong is winning a civil war, and then he's going to go through 10 years of Reconstruction, great, and all this kind of thing, but Cultural Revolution. But what you don't want the American Negro to do is continue to look beyond these shores for help. Certain people, Gerald Torn talks about this a lot, certain people were sacrificed. W.E.B. Du Bois, Shirley Graham Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Eslanda Good Robeson, take their passports, lock up old man Du Bois, this kind of thing. But, Walter White and these cats are more than happy to kind of accommodate. Well, that doesn't, that win doesn't ignore Howard. Howard is struggling with those internal tensions. And what I'd like to talk about for a few minutes this morning is how African studies at Howard represented those tensions, survived those tensions, emptied forward out of those tensions, and forged a space where it protected and protects inquiry that is designed to transform these conversations. So there's a kind of insurgency involved. As I came in and saw the books here, and it's funny, I think I have all but maybe 3 or 4 of those over there. And 2 of them in particular, Dr. Nyang, your book on Islam, that one of your books, the small one there, and the one just beyond it, Ayodele Langley's book on Pan-Africanism. When I got my copy of Langley's book, it was at the 100th anniversary of the first Pan-African conference, Henry Sylvester Williams conference in London. And that book's been out of print so long that, it's one of those things that tempts you to kind of liberate books from the library, so to speak. And I know that's a federal crime in this place, but I'm not about it. But when I saw one for sale, Red Lion Square, the book table, bookseller, right? It said, this is where C.L.R. James and Marcus Garvey used to speak at it. I was like, man, is that? I bought it. It was maybe 20 pounds, which was a lot of money for a graduate student in 2000. But when I came to Howard, had my job talk, I came down the hill to the Howard Center looking for Sulayman Nyang. I'd never seen him with my eyes before. And when I went up there knocking on doors, there was only one door open that afternoon. I mean, by that time, I didn't realize that many Howard faculty carry bankers hours. But this was an afternoon, like 5:30 in the afternoon, and that doesn't apply to the folks generally in African studies. But I saw an open door. I knocked on the door, and it said A. Langley. So I opened the door, and there's this older cat sitting in there. I said, I'm looking for Sulayman Nyang. He said, well, he's not here right now. I said, okay, well, I'll come. I said, you're not Ayodele Langley. He said, yes, I am. I said, what? I said, you're alive? That's the first thing. I mean, I was so embarrassed. No, because they don't always tell you when people pass, right? I mean, no, seriously. If anybody can confirm for me, and I'm going to finish because I'm mindful of the time. I've been talking about 5 minutes, 6, and so I know I'm going to be very mindful of this. But if anybody can tell me, for example, where and when J.C. DeGraff Johnson passed, because I can't find his obituary. Did he pass?
Yeah, I think he passed away.
See, I think it's practice, right? Because I've looked through all the kind of newspapers. I mean, because let me put this in parentheses. 1954 is a very important moment because you see 3 books emerge, right? Nations Negres et Culture, Chenka Joe. You see Stolen Legacy, which is, of course, George G.M. James's attempts to puddle through some of this thing, but he's at the University of Arkansas, I think Pine Bluff at the time. So, he's like Oliver Cox, who was at Langford. They're writing in very limited circumstances at these Negro colleges, and Cox is doing world theories 20 years before Emmanuel Wallerstein, but they're writing at these black colleges, and they're teaching. And the third book, of course, was J.C. DeGraff Johnson's, Jonah Coleman DeGraff Johnson's African Glory. So, but that's 1954, and these are far beyond the scope of what's being generally accepted as academic scholarship that is, is accepted by the white academy. Now, 1954, of course, is important because of Brown versus Board of Education. But what we're talking about, to kind of tie this together and then empty it into the frame that I had written down, we're talking about a moment now in 2013 of anniversaries, celebrations, commemorations. And what do these things do? Anniversaries are narrations. There are attempts to narrate the past in a way that makes the present make sense, justifies the present, explains the present, complicates the present, so that we can move forward. There's no other reason to talk about a 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. There's no other reason to talk about a 50th anniversary of the Birmingham bombings, or in the next 2 weeks, you'll see the whole country come to a stop in a way that it didn't for those first two, for the 50th anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy. But which will remind us again, as Frederick Douglass said, at these days of national ritual, you find out you're not part of this conversation. But the celebration of the 60th anniversary of African Studies at Howard gives us an opportunity to think about not only what happened 60 years ago, but what has happened since and what needs to happen going forward. So what we see then is the reinscription of a liberal consensus in some ways in the mid-50s. African Studies emerging as a kind of spy network, and folks who don't want to be part of that spy network trying to figure out, as Dr. Edgar said, how can we cut out a little space to operate and get a few pennies to do what we're going to do, because we're going to do it anyway. I mean, as he said, Ralph Bunche writes, and I forget how many pages he wrote that summer, that he ended up emptying into what becomes Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma. But a lot of his memos that don't find it into that manuscript extol the fact that what he says is the American Negro is a special award of the Supreme Court. And so Brown versus Board of Education in many ways is a concession to Cold War politics. We can't just keep beating these Negroes up while the world is looking, because the world is changing. We can't keep doing that. So they have to give Howard a few pennies in African Studies, even though they don't necessarily want to, but they leave it to Howard to figure out how to frame that appeal. And the Negro that gets left out is Hansberry. Why? Because Hansberry doesn't fit. You see, if you yank on William Leo Hansberry, Du Bois falls out. And now you got a real problem, because it was Du Bois who, when Hansberry was working in Mississippi, and help me, Ms. Hansberry, if I get this wrong, because I know this from years of listening to John Henry Clark and then reading people like Kwame West Alford and then listening. But Hansberry leaves Mississippi, goes to Atlanta. Well, he's got a few other places he ends up, but he ends up in Atlanta. He reads The Negro by Du Bois, 1915, and wants to read all the books in that bibliography, because Du Bois has finally given him what he was looking for, which is a global framework of dealing with Africa. And once he's dealing with Africa, he said, I got to go. Now he ends up at Harvard. He ends up not with the PhD because there's nobody there that can really train him. And plus, they're looking at him suspiciously anyway because he's making connections that nobody else is trying to make, not from the academic community. And so Hansberry, when he ends up at Howard, has been laboring like this from the 20s. You know, you say, I mean, Woodson came, stayed for a minute and left because he said, I'm not going to let these Negro administrators kill me. He moves down to 9th Street and keeps going with his work. Hansberry comes in for the long haul. But by the time this appeal is made, what you see is that Hansberry has to be marginalized in part because, you know, his approach is just too problematic. But what Hansberry's approach was attempting to do, African Studies at Howard continued to do anyway, in collaboration with its kind of partnerships with other folks around the campus and with the study of the African diaspora. And what it did was survive through several subsequent iterations of struggle. And what do I mean by that? It survives the Cold War era, and that's important to understand, because black institutions doing work like this were not in a position to be able to do very much. You know, I mean, the foundations would basically tell a lie. You know, they told St. Clair Drake and them that we don't give money to undergraduate programs. Well, that's not true. You gave money to other programs that were doing undergraduate work. They, and of course, St. Clair Drake is problematic because he can't prove that he's not a communist or communist affiliated. And of course, he's fortunate because who is with him by the time they're at Roosevelt dealing with African studies on the undergraduate level? Who but, of course, the Howard affiliated and at one time employee, Lorenzo Dow Turner, whose work on language, ironically, you can compare to what Howard has the prescience to do, which is deal with language study and African studies, which gives it a unique lens that makes it a little bit more difficult to dismiss Howard's African studies program, because language is really part of the key. Language study is not as well developed. When Hansberry starts looking for classical Africa, he's got to go, as Du Bois did, to the secondary sources. But by the time you get to the 1960s, Shekinah Job has begun to emerge, again on the periphery of these white conversations, not in African studies, still being kind of marginalized. But Howard eventually is going to provide a space where some of these things can be brought back into the conversation. But at first it has to survive the Cold War era, and it did. Now the 1960s come, and now you have a problem. Why? You got another problem. You got Negroes coming to school who were never supposed to be educated in the first place. And you have the long retreat from the Cold War dodge that Brown kind of gestures toward. Brown is like, oh, let's desegregate, but they never desegregated. 10 years later, they're like, none of these schools desegregated. So then you see another swell unrest. That's the 50th anniversary stuff that's going on now. The Birmingham stuff that happened in the spring of 1963, the March on Washington, which was a kind of negotiated settlement between Kennedy and his forces and the elite leadership of the civil rights movement, which kind of made SNCC kind of mad, but you know, John Lewis was going to go along to get along because in part his Southern grounding and his ability to kind of negotiate the tensions between the older elite in the civil rights movement and the kind of shock troops of the movement, which was the students, gave him a space to negotiate. But then you empty that out, and the response to the March on Washington in many ways is the bombing in Birmingham. You know, when you not only have Caroline Robertson and y'all know them, Addie Mae Collins, and who are the other two young ladies? Caroline Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair. Not only those four girls, but you have James Robinson and another young brother, Virgil Ware, who were killed the same day. One by the police, shot in the back, and the other one on the handlebar of his bicycle. They're in a rock fight with the white boy gangs that have gathered around 16th Street Baptist Church. It's war going on in Birmingham. Of course, Kennedy dies by the end of the year, and you've got turmoil. But that becomes the impetus to let Lyndon Johnson ram through what ends up being the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Okay, that's it. What else do you Negroes want? Over the next 10 years, however, that's when you see the long retreat. The long retreat from the idea that y'all are going to have political equality in this country. But by then, many students are on black college campuses who were never supposed to be in school. And those Negroes aren't satisfied. That's where my department came from. For many people in this room understand that that student movement that emptied into the Tour de Black University Conference in 1968 and then the founding of Afro-American Studies Department in 1969, of which I'm so glad to hear Dr. Batiste is a proud graduate among the vanguard of that undergraduate group that came through, established that department to do something different. At the same time, African Studies at Howard continue to do something different, but freed up with a little bit of space to operate, they're actually able to capture some of that momentum from the late 60s, because in that same 1960 year of 1969, that's when them Negroes walk out of the African Studies Association and form the African Heritage Studies Association and say, no, now we're going to negotiate with y'all, but it will be from a position of strength. Now you have people who have real problems with that. Why? Because we love you Negroes as long as you all are our pets. You know, Melville Hurst, this and these kind of guys. But black people are no longer inclined to be pets. No longer inclined to be the favorites of certain foundations and the sprinkling of a nickel here when we're going to give everybody else $100. No, we are going to try to establish an independent beachhead out of which to operate. And AHSA ends up meeting at Howard subsequently to kind of put that together. African Studies at Howard is at the center of that conversation. Now, I'm going to make a turn to conclude, because I'm very mindful about 5 minutes, I think. That's what makes sure. No, I want to make sure that, no, ma'am, because really the important thing I think about these moments is, however short we have, is the question and answer and conversation. Because I take notes the whole time. I'm learning about that because, you know, we teach and I'm in the classroom, and I think our undergraduate students particularly need to know this material. Hansberry is still, you know, passed away in 1965, but his presence is still felt at Howard, but it's marginal. The way Dr. Dodson said, it's not institutionalized. It's very important to understand that, because had it been institutionalized, we would have been light years ahead in every academic field. In every academic field. You know, and let's not even get to the small bore academic politics. I mean, does Alain Locke support Hansberry's Fulbright so he can get him out of the country because they're about to make this pitch for African studies and they don't want the Negro even around on the soil? Frazier, who has done so much important work, he, Ralph Bunche, Abram Harris, these guys, and insurgents kind of saying that Du Bois isn't radical enough, but yet and still in the mid-50s will dare to tell the foundation that, you know, you don't worry about Hansberry, I got that. Yeah. But African studies still provides a core out of which emerges scholarship that transforms the way we think about so many different approaches to the study of Africa. At the same time, in the 1970s, after the students have unceremoniously kind of dumped, or led to the dumping of James Neighbor, which is kind of sad. I mean, it's intergenerational, you know. But then James Sheik shows up, hires Andrew Billingsley, and then you see Ron Walters come here, Joyce Ladner come here, Robert Hill come here. There's going to be another wave in the 1970s, and African Studies rides that wave as well. And then you see some of the folks who were sitting in this room who were recruited into that same conversation. That becomes the bridge to now. And where is now? In 2013, I know from where we are in African American Studies, several years ago, we went through this whole program review thing. And, you know, the first thing that everybody always wants to do is say black. Okay, so let's put all the black together. That usually means that white HWCUs, historically white college universities, if you got an African Studies department and an African American Studies department, you just say black and then stick Afro-diasporic world studies of the whole black thing together and say, okay, that's beautiful. University of Texas, Austin, Michigan State. I mean, you know, this is what they do. But what do you do with it at a black school? And not just any black school, the school that has led this conversation. Well, the way we think about it is, in Afro-American studies, we're the unit that doesn't have to be big, because our whole reason for existence is to theorize the possibility of reconstructing discipline so that we can think differently, and that's for two reasons. Number one, to have our own academic discipline with methodology, inquiry techniques, and deal with that. So and that in itself is a step eventually to getting rid of all the disciplines, but you got to have that first step, which means language training. We're the only university, HBCU in the country, probably university, where you can study ancient Egyptian language. Hansberry would have had a ball now. We got the only Egyptologist of African descent trained in the United States and the world on our faculty, and he's one of two. So now you can take all the forms of the classical language. But the second reason, as I conclude, I think is very much important for African studies at Howard, and history at Howard, and economics at Howard, and all the other academic fields. Every one of those fields must continue to mount an insurgent campaign to destroy those disciplines, as we stand here in Mr. Jefferson's library and everything that has been added since. Just like this library has as its founding template places that I've stood in many times, and I'm so glad you hear from Kemet from Egypt. Those first libraries that they call Peraq in the ancient Egyptian language, this is not the first library. It's an important library. It's an extension of a literary tradition. But what the academic feels that Howard must do is reclaim human knowledge in all of those disciplines. And there's no more important place to do that than the place that is marked by its study literally of the African continent and the extension of Africa throughout the diaspora. And that is the Department of African Studies. I'm gonna stop with that, and maybe we can have some more questions. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Angel and Milton. These are two people I know. I know Jane because we have been working on Middle Eastern issues with her husband. We were in Middle East studies for years, and I'm very happy that we have you here. Now, what he is saying now, this was unthinkable, that you will have Jane and her under one intellectual roof. There are powerful forces who don't want that to happen, you see, because of their own interests. I am now going to use the metaphor of putting you on my mental highway. So on an HOV lane, you'll be moving very fast, we don't have time. I'm going to move very fast because you see, what Dr. Carr was saying, for you, the audience, and for all of you listening through internet and the media, I want you to be on the same frame with me. So I'll be moving out to tell you Howard University, the Library of Congress, and Africa. How do you look at these three? I went to the University of Virginia. I was a Jefferson Fellow. We were the first blacks to go to UVA. Randall Robinson was shocked when Bob Cummings, who used to be the head of our department, that this guy got his PhD from UVA. I said, are you joking? Because they were not allowed to go to UVA as blacks. They would rather pay for them to go to Yale and study there to get their degree than to get their degrees at the University of Virginia. So when we talk about Mr. Jefferson, he's now gone, but there's a legacy. We cannot deny that. But in his note on Virginia, he doesn't think that black people and white people will ever be equal. He will be shocked to know that there's an Obama in the White House. I'm very serious. I'm a Jefferson scholar. What I'm trying to tell you is when we talk about the Library of Congress, African Studies, and Howard, you're dealing with three concepts and three ideas. Please follow me as I move very fast. What you have to recognize is that Howard University is named after General Howard. When we talk about the Freedmen Bureau and Howard University, that's the origin. Because after the end of slavery, you have a large number of African Americans. There were 400,000 blacks in the United States. If you go back to one of our professors at Howard University, Andrew Billingsley. Andrew Billingsley wrote a book, Climbing Jacob's Ladder, which is a biblical metaphor. And there he tries to talk about black families in white America. Now that book is very interesting metaphor as an entry point to understand Howard University, the Library of Congress, and Africa. Because if you really go back, you will see that after the end of the Civil War, the black identity was still problematic because African Americans, 1 out of every 16 African American was called a free black. And they were the ones who founded these black churches with Richard Allen, called African Methodist Church Zion. And if you look at the history of the religions in this city, you get that story. That's number one. So there was tension about with Africa or not with Africa. That was a big debate nationally. Some of the people who established the American Colonization Society were interested in taking all the free blacks and put them in Liberia. That's why you have Monrovia, named after President Monroe. Now, move fast with me. And you come back to our first presentation, where you are now trying to locate Africa at Howard. Mordecai Johnson was the first African American to be the head of Howard University. Now you have to go back to the founding fathers who came to Howard. That was why the first hospital we have before James Chick was called the Freedman's Hospital. Today, if you come to Howard University, we have a radio station, we have the credit union, and we have the School of Communication, and then you have the graduate school. That is a Chickian metaphor. It is part of the evolution of Howard University. When Mordecai Johnson came to town, they were able to negotiate a deal which gave Howard University one position. Howard University and Lincoln University in Nebraska were among the, and this other one is right here, is named after the University for the Handicapped and the Blind. Gallaudet. These were the three schools ever given money by the Congress of the United States. And we are carrying that legacy as a university. So that's one of the reasons why Howard presidents must always have their feet on the fire every year with the Congress to get money. And that is one of our legacies. So if you are talking about African studies at Howard, you have to recognize that. The reason why Hansberry, Wilfred L were in a problematic relationship. You see, and Ralph Bunche and all of those people they are dealing with, they were the victims of academic politics in American society. You have the big people who have money, like the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers were the ones who financed the International Africa Institute, which were doing all the anthropological work out of London University. Malinowski, Hansberry was dealing with those people. Now, that was Hansberry was not going to be given any kind of break by those people. No, the Rockefellers, they don't want the black people to go to Africa. That was Garvey. They're not going to allow Garvey. Garvey was in jail in 1924. They're not going to allow that to happen. So when you look at that story, you understand the story how, if you look at the Presbyterian Church was very active in trying to train many of these Africans to go back to Liberia. That is one of the reasons why, if you look at Lincoln University, and you can see how Lincoln University, Horace Mann Bourne, the father of Julian Bourne, he had a difficult time. He and Hansberry were trying to promote African studies at Howard, and they wanted to get the cooperation of E. Franklin Frazier. Hell no, you're not going to get any money from foundation. And that's one of the reasons why Rayford Logan, who wrote his book, The Betrayal of the Negro, talks about how black people were double-crushed after the Civil War by President Rutherford. Remember the Rutherford, who made the deal. They moved all the federal troops out of the South to the North. That is what changed the history of the African Americans. So wait a minute, Africa? What are you talking about Africa? We have Monrovia. We put all those free blacks down there. That's why Booker T. Washington, when he gave that famous speech, cast down your bucket. Where you at? In Atlanta, which was a turning point. He knew that many of the black people were called African Methodist Church. The white people were invading Africa. Africa is being invaded. They call them these savages. And some of the intellectuals came with Tarzan and the cannibals. It became a dominant narrative. If I'm black, why would I call myself African? These primitives? No way. So Booker T knew Spanish 101, let's call ourselves Negroes. And all African American women, Negress, like tigress. We move away from that narrative. Now you see, that was why Du Bois, one thing we have lost at Howard, most of the black intellectuals at Howard, like he was saying, they will all go to Europe. You go to Oxford. That's why we have who? We have a hall named after him, Locke Hall. He became the first African American to go to Oxford. And they gave him what? Cecil Rhodes, the imperialist. He went to Oxford. He was allowed to go there. So he came back, he became one of the intellectuals from your area there. Another black Spanish, where he was. in Harlem. What do we call that? Sunbag. He was a black Puerto Rican. There were some Spanish Jews. Lorenzo out here. We have a school name after him now. They were Spanish Jews who are blacks. There are some of the black leadership here. Lorenzo's. And another black American who became famous, and you know him. He's the big singer, Paul Robson. Paul Robson married this black Jewish slave ancestry, Lansbury. So that's one of the, have to understand that narrative. You see, Cardosa, that is the narrative. Paul Robson, remember Paul Robson, well-known Paul Robson. I'm going to read a narrative that will talk to you about something that's very interesting in the interest of time. You see, so when you come to talk about how, when Hansberry wanted to get money, Horace Mann wanted money, they said they don't want to have any money. That's why Dr. Edgar revealed to you, they will give money to Ralph Bunch. They gave him money. They don't give money to Hansberry. They will not give money to Horace Mann born. In the end, they made out a deal. Rayford Logan, who was the secretary of Du Bois when they went to World War I to push Pan-Africanism, Rayford Logan had to make a deal. They say, okay, we'll give you some money. Rayford Logan, you have to understand Howard politics. At that time at Howard, you have Hansberry, you have many of the African Americans who are interested in Africa, they were still not going to be allowed because the British and the French will never allow them to do research. And the Rockefellers were not going to allow them to go there. They have all their anthropologists to do work. That's the narrative. So that is one of the reasons why we have at Howard University African studies and Afro-American studies. It was the revolution of the students. These students in 1968, this is where all of you are involved now. All of you in the room here, your stories are involved. In 1968, the people who controlled the academy were the Rockefellers, the Ford, and the Carnegie people. They give you money or they don't give you any money. In Chicago, they have all those Jewish intellectuals who are fleeing from the Nazis. They became this Chicago school. And these are the people who are the children of Norman Padelford at Harvard. All these scholars, David Apter and all of them were trained at Harvard by Norman Padelford, who were writing about self-determination. So James Coleman, all of the people that you read as graduates of the graduate school, these were the students. They are the intellectual grandchildren. Most of you are the great-great-grandchildren of Norman Padelford. And what is very interesting for us to understand, if you talk about Howard University and African studies, let me move quickly in the next 5-6 minutes to get out of here. What I want to make very clear to you is that you see, in 1958, people like Adam Clayton Powell, among the 4 blacks who are on the Congress here, Adam Clayton Powell was very powerful because he was able to have tenure because the blacks in Harlem were keeping in office over and over again. So he survived and he became the chairman of the House Committee on Education and Labor. That was why he was very important. That was why people like me, young men from Africa, came here. And I ended in Mississippi in 1965. I would have been Abdoulaye Diallo in Mississippi. But it didn't happen. I was sent to Hampton University. Adam Clayton Powell's secretary was his administrative assistant. His father-in-law was Horace, out there at Hampton, the registrar. You see, and his brother Davis, Horace Davis, his brother was at Howard University in English department. David. Yes. That's why I came to Howard. You see. So what I'm trying to tell you, your stories are linked together, all of you in the room here. In 68, the students had a coup d'etat. You have a coup d'etat, they get the president out, and they brought Chink with his Dasi key. And the African studies is implicated here, and the Afro-American studies implicated here. You have Russell Adams was at Chicago. They were able to get him like Russell. Just when Edgar was talking about our brother at now we have an institution named after Ralph Bunche. You see, Russell was one of the African Americans who went to Chicago and I get a degree. Thanks to, my brother is here. His father was, John H. Franklin Jr. Stand up, John. John, his father was the fellow who wrote the story of the African American history. He was at Howard. He went, that was the first time they get all our black intellectuals to Chicago. And when they went to Chicago, people like Russell Adams were students there. They were trained. Russell became acceptable. Blacks like Nyang got a PhD from UVA, you black from UVA. You're from Chicago, his father was there. He trained them, they came back. That's why Hansel Brary's ideas now beginning to take root. When the kids have a coup d'etat at Howard, I remember this. You have James Chick from North Carolina. Then you have Chike Anawachi from Nigeria, who was teaching at Fisk. And there is a story which is recently revived by one of our guest speakers at Howard. How Chike Anawachi from Nigeria dealt with Stokely Carmichael. And Stokely Michael and others were a part of that narrative. They graduated already. When Adam Clayton Powell gave that commencement address at Howard, he used the word black power. That was the first time Stokely Carmichael, a student at Howard, had black power from Adam Clayton Powell. He went to Mississippi, he said, black power. And you know the rest of that is history now. So the Howard students booted out their president. And when that happened now, people like Joseph Applegate was recruited from UCLA to come and deal. This is how the connection now. We have Middle East studies and African studies coming together here. When Joseph Applegate came to Howard, he was a linguist. He knew Berber, and he was linking North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. That is how Hans Berry narrative now get fulfilled. You see, so when Joe Applegate came and Rigsby, they became actively involved at Howard. When James Chick came out with his Dasiki, all the young people say, we want to have an Afro-American studies. And Q.T. Jackson was the head of the African Studies department at that time. He invited all the black student leaders. We came to Howard, and unfortunately, April King was killed. That is why sometimes I tell to people, there is a God. Barack Hussein Obama was a 7-year-old boy. King was killed. King went to Memphis, and he was speaking like Moses. I have been to the mountaintop. I may not get there with you. Lo and behold, just like Joshua, Obama will be the Joshua, and Caleb is not mentioned all the time. They reached the promised land. They got to the White House. To be biblical again, when Obama got to the White House, he became the only one who went and took the oath of office and said, I, Barack, the Chief Justice pushed him back. Then he has to come back. Hussein, all the Arabs were jumping up and down. You see, like, so the thing is, Obama, you see, that is history again. It goes back to you. Because you see, in the Afro-American studies, African studies, all your stories are coming up. All of what you are doing come together. From King at Memphis, Barack Hussein, 7-year-old boy, becoming president 40 years later, and he happens to have something that, who can write the video? Only God can do that. He has a Muslim name. The only American president who ever has a Muslim name was Teddy Roosevelt. The Jews and Arabs got along before Israel. They were peddlers. The Jews and Arabs in New York City gave him a Muslim name when he was the chief of police. They called him Harun Rashid Roosevelt. And what is very interesting for us here who are studying Africa is that when you go back to Teddy Roosevelt having a Muslim name, the only American president ever to have a Muslim nickname, and when he went on safari in Kenya, Obama's grandfather was alive. Neither Roosevelt nor Obama's grandfather knew that one day a young man from Kenya will be in the White House. Because what is very pronounced for us here studying about Africa, the American Colonization Society, and what is happening in Arabs in American society, Muslims in American society, is this story. And that is, not only was Obama 7, when King was killed, 40 years later, he became president of the United States, and he has a Muslim name, but most importantly, for all of us who are studying about Africa, blacks and the American civilization, 2 footnotes for all of you here. That is, when Teddy Roosevelt was the president of the United States, he wanted to invite Booker T. Washington, the most powerful black man in America, to the White House. Hell no, a nigger in the White House? No way! Guess who is coming to dinner now? That is one of the reasons why the Obama people are very much aware of this. And they awarded our colleague from Bahamas, Sidney Poitier, the Medal of Freedom during the Obama first term. So history is being made by all of you here in Africa Middle East Studies, all of us who are studying Morland Spinard. If you go back to Morland Spinard, where he is now dealing with the reality, it deals with the history of the NAACP, the Young Turks, because when Booker T said we are Negroes, most of the educated blacks know that the Negro means black. But the black who are not educated, if you say Negro, they will accept it. That was why Du Bois said we are colored. They use the word colored. That's why we have Negro and colored interchangeably. That's what Du Bois. Du Bois was being political. He knew that the Asians, the Arabs, the Jews, the Italians could all be called. They were not accepted as white. That's why you have books, how the Jew became white, how the Irish became white, how the Italian became white. This is America. And I will stop here. I can speak for days. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nyang. To all of the guest panelists, I'd like to thank all of you for a very, very interesting and stimulating conversation. We do see the uniqueness of the intellectual traditions of African studies at Howard. At this point, we'll take questions for a good 15, 20 minutes. The first question, my boss, Dr. Mary Jane.
So I want to thank you all for a really an exciting and stimulating panel. I mean, it really is. And I'm going to repeat the question I asked Dr. Dodson a bit earlier, perhaps phrase it in a different way. You mentioned being out of the conversation. Okay. Now, in antiquity, when you write about when the Greeks write, they speak about the great armies of Ethiopia, they speak about, they're in the conversation. When you get the beginning of Christianity, okay, the first churches, early churches, okay, Ethiopia, they're in the conversation. When you get into Islam, the great scholars from Timbuktu and other parts of Africa, they're in the conversation. So what I'm saying here is when, why, do they fall out of the conversation? And the second part is Howard University, since we're talking about Howard University, bringing the conversation back, putting it back on the table, the students, the professors, putting the conversation back on the table. That's my question. All of you, I mean, whoever wants to answer it.
Let me just take a quick stab at that. First of all, thank you for that. That question is really the question. We, African people were pushed out of that narrative probably around between the time of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance. Yeah. Now we know, Martin Bernal, who recently passed away, did a lot of work in that regard with Black Athena, particularly Volume 1, the falsification of the ancient model. That's why he proposed his revised ancient model. So it wasn't the Greeks, it wasn't the Romans, it was in fact a medieval moment. At the same time, Europe began to expand. So we know that. We know how it was pushed out. Is Howard attempting to bring it back in? I don't know. I think the shadow of Booker T. Washington still falls on black colleges. The President of the United States seems to be a convicted Washingtonian when it comes to vocational education. And I think Howard is so fascinated with the possibilities of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the STEM fields, that even those who have proposed STEAM, adding the arts to that equation, are marginalized. So I don't know. But the last thing I'll say is that it's very interesting because there's always been that strain of folks who have preserved that narrative. When you mentioned Hansberry read Du Bois's 1915, The Negro, and it set him into his intellectual orbit. But that 1950 book, Du Bois rewrote it twice. Once is The World in Africa, kind of extended in 1945, and the other one was his volume, Black Folk, Then and Now. That becomes the kind of discursive frame for what St. Clair Drake does with black folk here and there, putting us back in the narrative. And Drake kind of deals with Bernal in that book. But then you have Joseph Harris. Now we bring it home to Howard. Global Dimensions of the African Diaspora, both editions, volumes. The challenge for Howard is not to convene this conversation, but to finally empty away from those academic disciplines, because you can never get where we need to go by reinscribing the power relations in the traditional disciplines. That's what makes Afro-American studies important. And that's why we, proposing the name change to Africana studies, because Africana isn't really a description that should be an umbrella term for everything, we don't think. It becomes a marker for a theoretical enterprise, and the other academic disciplines have to stay in place because the work in there has to rise to an institutional level and become the beachhead to deconstruct those disciplines at the other universities. We think Howard is the only place that has a shot at it. And so, because we have everything here in one place. But the thing I'll say is the undiscovered country, the last frontier in that conversation, is the will. And that's not an intellectual project. That's not an ideological project. That is pure political economy. Because academic degrees are about licensure. And people are terrified if they take that step, they will not be able to work. So I think that's where we are.
And I would answer the second part of your question, thusly. I'll go so far as to say that if Howard does not ultimately have the courage to pursue this leadership role over the intellectual hegemony of knowledge about the black experience, if Howard doesn't have the courage to do it, quite frankly, it calls into question its rationale for existence. Right. The traditional rationale has been to train black leaders. Okay? A whole bunch of people are doing that now. A whole bunch of people are doing it. A whole bunch of colleges, universities, and all the rest of that are doing that now. And the one thing that Howard, now I need to go back. We start off, Howard was a missionary school. A missionary school. There actually had been a black who was president before Mordecai Johnson.
That's right.
John Mercer Langston.
That's right.
They would not make him permanent president. And at the base of it was that the missionaries were not prepared to follow the lead of a black person leading a black school. Okay? And that was in the 1860s, early 70s. And it went to 1926 before, and the debate over the intellectual leadership of the institution at the level of board of trustees, at the level of faculty, all of that was ongoing struggle. But behind that debate was this question of black leadership intellectually in defining the character of the institution and what its unique role was going to be. A truce was I guess, declared with Mordecai Johnson's appointment. But quite frankly, the war for intellectual hegemony has continued right down to the present time. And it's fascinating, what was the industrial school conversation, industrial versus classical conversation in the 19th, early 20th century is now the STEM versus liberal arts.
That's right. That's
conversation. And I guess my final comment is that basically, doing three things. One, when you lose the intellectual argument in defining the meaning of your life, you simply end up living somebody else's notion of your life.
That's right.
Okay. So the struggle intellectually is not simply some intellectual gameplay. This is life and death stuff, in a most fundamental way. But beyond that, because we start out as a colonial institution, and quite frankly, we're still colonized. Howard University, help me? Huh? We're still colonized. And we're not conscious of the fact that we are, and so we continue to live the damn colonized life. Huh? And if we can't, if the intellectual community that's at Howard can't figure out how to make the breakthroughs, that's right, then we're in deep mess. But beyond that, ultimately, human beings live their lives when they take ownership of it. Huh? When they take ownership and define what the hell they're going to do. And you run up against all kinds of obstacles, but ultimately you have to envision and struggle to create your world and live in your world. And again, if you don't have the courage to do that, you don't live your life, you live somebody else's life, that something somebody else has defined for you. And so I say that to say that Howard is, in my judgment, at one of those critical moments in its history. And we don't need to engage other people's discourse. We need to be fashioning one of our own. Huh? And the work of doing that needs to be at the center of what Howard is doing intellectually today. And I'll stop there. But I'm very, 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 very upset and very concerned because again, our intellectual leadership has been kind of following the tail of the dog of American intellectual leadership. And we have a different intellectual agenda and a different set of intellectual responsibilities. And if we don't take responsibility for it, who's going to do it? And I'll stop.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say I'm a proud Howard alum, Howard undergrad and grad. And although I never majored in African Studies was a part of every class that I took. I was a communications major with an English minor.
Your question?
Yeah. Julian Mayfield was there.
Oh, yeah.
I was an art history master's degree with African history. Aziz Batran was there. There is a difference in the undergrad of Howard University now than there was at the time I was there. It's not because of the faculty. I'm wondering how the faculty then can help to put that fire back into the undergrad, because as Dr. Nyang said, it was the students who caused the movement. And I don't see that happening in Howard's undergrad right now, especially looking at what just happened a couple of weeks ago at homecoming. The priorities have changed. What is it that we as alum can do and the faculty can do to help put the fire back into the undergrad so that they can then move on to graduate studies and bring Howard back to what it used to be?
I would say this as somebody who deals with a lot of undergrads. They come to us with a different literacy. electronic technology has literally reconfigured the way that we deal with information, obviously. The national trend is to entertain students on the way in a reward structure that empties into kind of a, and Howard talked about this kind of indeterminate space as it relates to labor force. In other words, our young people don't have a destination right now. They had a destination during the Booker T. Washington era. I mean, there was jobs for them with no job, except perhaps the value of literally of their bodies, which is why the prison industrial complex is growing. The leadership class that Howard spoke of, being trained by Howard and other places, really doesn't require content mastery as much as it requires a kind of voc ed kind of orientation that allows you to manage technology. What we've done, in conclusion to that, because I know we can get much conversation we can talk more about this afterwards. What we've attempted to do is integrate some structural steps, particularly like College of Arts and Sciences, we do a freshman seminar. Yes. And it's very deeply ingrained in kind of African knowledge systems. We had Ngugi wa Thiong'o last year, Wole Soyinka was here earlier this week. Putting it where students can get it. Last thing I'll say, those freshmen then coming into that curriculum that you mentioned, African studies, Afroamerican studies, English, philosophy, political science, economics, in the general education curriculum, then are reintroduced to those concepts they get as freshmen. And now the proof will be in the pudding. We track those students. This Reconfigured Freshman Seminar is only 3 years old. We will see as they come forward what it's going to produce. But we are, as Dr. Dodson said, fighting. The recently retired president was very clear about this. And in the process of academic renewal, it was hardwired into the structure of where we will go. I have no faith whatsoever that plan, which took over 3 years to develop, will go forward in the future, because I'm not sure that the leadership of the institution, I mean the board of trustees, ever got it. And I'm talking about not everybody, but clusters ever got it. And I think that what it will take now, we will have to revisit that process. But we're not far. We're not far. It's there to be actualized if we can just make this last push.
And you were talking about the students.
Let me say right quick. That's what got him out of retirement at the Schomburg. That was part of the P-Car. We put his squad on Howard Dodson and drug him out of New York City. No, literally, that was part of the process. That's what I'm saying.
No, how would you get to him?
No question.
I was going to say with regard to students.
Excuse me.
Sure, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you finish. I'm
okay.
sorry.
With regard to students, one of the concerns I have, and it's part of what's informing the work we're doing at the library, is that if you will, the intellectual culture of the school needs to be fixed. And what you saw at Yard Fest, quite frankly, in some respects, reflects the misplaced priorities of the institution in relationship to the students. I'll say it another way. Freshmen arrive, and the first thing they do the first week that they're on the campus, they're doing rock climbing and other kinds of crap. I'm sorry. And they're being oriented to Howard, and the orientation is a whole bunch of damn play. And I've had the conversation with the president and with some other folk about this, and so I'm not talking out of school. And we hope to change that in some meaningful ways. But the other piece is that the mission of the institution is teaching, learning, and research. And that needs to be the dominant discourse that's going on campus damn near 24/7. The way we're redoing the library is to facilitate that kind of intellectual discourse, and hoping to, through that, begin to serve as a kind of catalyst for changing if you will, the intellectual culture of the institution. At the time when the kids were in the 60s and early 70s, out beyond their classes, they were intellectually engaged. Mm-hmm. Okay? Mm-hmm. And that's where we need to return in order to recreate this kind of intellectual vitality that's purposeful intellectual activity rather than this kind of play stuff that's going on right now.
Okay. One more question, and I'm sorry, you had the question. Next question.
This is very refreshing. Angel and I were contemporaries in the African Studies Department. I think I ran through it real fast because I have 2 kids to take care of, so I couldn't hang around now. And the mask kept pushing me, so I had to roll it. It's so wonderful to see the tables turned, though, because Nyang, now we can call him Sulayman. He used to be a teacher, but now guess who's the boss over there? Angel. You see, that's great. That's, because Dr. Nyang told me that. He said, when you pass the torch, and then the person who you taught becomes the one who you have to be beholden to, it's great. Now, rolling it in terms of poet, we have a great legacy, but I'm wondering where that legacy went. I was taught by Damas, I was taught by C.R. James, so was Angel. Elliot Skinner, all these people. Elliot Skinner used to run down here from Columbia on the train or whatever, back on foot, I don't know, because they didn't have the shuttle there, so you have to walk to Meridian. And he used to run down here, teach us, run back. Okay? We have great professors, yes. But where is the legacy of intellectual curiosity? Where is the legacy of excellence? I was told once that these students pay a lot to take your class, so they have to pass. I used to have to do 3, 4 jobs just to pay for my schooling because I didn't have the right papers to get a real job. And I used to have to run to T Street, run back on the hill, there's no shuttle. Go take a class just to earn maybe $5 in one day. And I added up all those 5s and I paid my $275 for my tuition and 5 something for my room and board. So what I'm saying is we need to stop all that because it's not fair to Howard. Okay, now let's look at the Morland Spinard Research Center. My students, if they're studying Spanish, they have to do a paper on something to do with Afro-Hispanic writers or something. But when I ask them, how many people have been to the Morland Spinard Research Center? They look at me like, what's that? And I'm in law color Douglas Hall. So I'm wanting to ask what has happened, the panel, what has happened between now and then. I was there in the 60s when I stood on the roof and saw from Meridian everywhere burning. What has happened between now and then, and how can we correct it? Because sometimes we run our mouths, but we don't have any solutions. And I really want to find a solution to how we can stop all this And we have some administrators who don't really know about the legacy of Howard, and they don't care. As long as the money's in their pocket, it's fine. So I want to know how we can make African studies, African American studies with great people like Dr. Nyang, great intellect. You know what I like about them? They don't read. I can't stand for you to read to me, because I can read. All of this comes straight from the head and the knowledge. Thank you, guys. I like when you roll it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Because you see, if you look at human beings and the manner in which we have made progress, we have to have legacies. We are prisoners of letters and numbers. The whole history of human beings is letters and numbers. We speak English, that's why we alphabet. You can be Chinese, Arabic speaker, you have your letters. You see, what she is saying, and those people are gone, but they remember, Hansberry is gone, but she is still alive. Not only because of biological livelihood, because some of us still remember him as memories. When he is speaking, C.L.R. James was in African studies. He was a great intellect. We have Elliot Skinner, who was at Columbia University, was a visiting professor at African studies, then Leon Damas, one of the troika of the negritude movement. You see, so there are great scholars at Howard, but when we are talking about Hansberry, when we refer Logan and all of them, that they are victims of circumstances beyond their control. You can have great intellect, but you don't have supporters. You see, the greatest people in human history, if you look at Jesus Christ, he was only 33 years old. There are now billions of human beings who are still remembering him, but he could not have done it without those apostles and disciples. You can look at Muhammad, look at Buddha, look at more recently, look at Gandhi and the Indian narrative today. You see, you have to have people who follow the tradition. That's what she's saying to us. We're here now at the Library of Congress. All of you in the room here, all of you with the modern technology, what we are doing here, each one of you can be blogging or tweeting and pushing ideas to millions of people. That's the capabilities we have now. We didn't have that before. So if I go back to her question, in '68, those students at Howard changed history. Today we have a whole department of Afro-American studies, and I support the idea. Why would you be studying black when you are an African-American at Hampton? Actually, what is very ironic in terms of our intellectual history, you don't find any African-American studies program in the HBCU with an Afro-American studies program. None. That's right. None. They don't have an African studies program. None. What happened is those are captured in the history department. That's right. Left to some elements in the old order, there will be no Afro-American studies. The kids say, we are not going to accept that. We don't want to be colonized intellectually. That was why when we were students, Franz Fanon, black skin, white mask, was very popular with the kids. The problem she is asking now, do we have students today who are like them? When they were students, they were reading books. Do we have books for the modern kids? These kids are now prisoners. I tell them, I was just speaking to this undergraduate. I said, you are the prisoners of the electron. Once upon a time, no, because they don't talk to each other. How are you going to learn if you don't talk to one another? You see, once upon a time, you're walking down the street and you're talking to yourself, man or woman, they say, that guy is crazy. No, they don't say anything. I tell them the demarcation line between insanity and sanity is very thin because of the electron. And that's what she is complaining. You cannot organize if you don't talk to other people. You are next to me, you're talking to somebody 500 miles away. You say, hello, I'm wondering where you talk to me. I stop there. Then you understand our problem. Yes. We have to live with it. All of us. It's not me, all of us.
But I just want to add to that and say that I think and you know, it's a question of how we construct the past again. I don't think Howard was ever that place. I think that we are at a different time, to be sure. But, and I mentioned the freshman seminar, and I say this because there are a lot of hardworking faculty in this room right now. When you see that bridge, the reality is that there are a number of faculty departments all over Howard's campus that are doing that work. There are faculty that send their undergraduate students even to Morland Spinard and have never stopped doing that. In the Department of African Studies, we fought during the PCAR process, as academic renewal, to make sure that African Studies kept its undergraduate program. Because it's very important to have undergraduate and graduate students in close proximity. They were going to try to shut that program. We said, hell no, you're not going to shut it, because y'all don't understand what Howard is. Finally, there are a number of students. There are study groups that take place after 5 o'clock on that campus every night. Kwame Ture Society, Students Against Mass Incarceration, even the fraternities and sororities. The Alphas had their week. I spent 2 hours with them last night with 100 kids in a room talking about Jim Crow and legal segregation from 1850 to the present. They are doing it all the time. Often what I find is that folks who are the most critical of what's going on at Howard, who are on Howard's campus, are the ones with the least amount of contact with the students. It's very easy to launch criticism from an administrative conversation. What I find is that criticism evaporates in the heat of actually doing the work, which is why I say African studies, as far as I'm concerned, the models of Sulayman Nyang, the models of Cham, the models of the faculty, the model of Bob Cummings,
Yes, Bob Cummings. Yes.
and whose wife is still teaching, by the way, at Howard, is a model of producing scholarship while they go meet their classes every day. And that is rarely done at schools where research is emphasized and they have very little contact with African, which is why all these Negroes writing about Africa and Afro-American and all the diaspora stuff, I invite them to come here for lectures, because my first question is, do you teach? If it is no, then just give me the book then. I don't need to hear you anymore. Because here at Howard, we work for a living. That's a very different conversation. So anyway, that's what I'm saying.
Okay. At this point, one last question, because you have been holding your hand up quite a while, and this will be our last question.
My name is Nirla Mahmoud, and I am a graduate student in the African Studies. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you. Just my comment and question to Dr. Dodson. I do agree with you about Howard campus is Colonized, and I have an example of this. With my first year when I came to Howard, I used to use Starbucks, and I would sit there and study. And over the last year, I noticed this since the beginning of this year, there was so many pictures, photos hanging on the walls of Starbucks of Dr. King, Harry Truman, Frederick Douglass. They're no longer there. And when I asked, they were saying people complained about taking them down, and then they are not taking them, they're not putting them back. And this is one of the things, it's my suggestion, can we, in an attempt to decolonize our campus, acknowledge, it's a suggestion for Dr. Cham to acknowledge Mayo Johannesburg participation and his great contribution to the African studies, to name our graduate lounge under his name, and that's
If those pictures came down in part, that's one of the reasons why, if you watched baseball at all last month and you saw Magic Johnson sitting up in the as the owner of the LA Dodgers, Magic Johnson sold all his stakes in Starbucks around the country in order to leverage the money to become a minority partner of the LA Dodgers. When he sold the Starbucks, that's when the black pictures came down. Yeah. I just want to let you know in terms of, but that doesn't mean they can't go back up, though. I think they should. Yeah. That's very good. Yeah.
And that's one of those examples of basically you defining yourself in your space.
Yes.
I mean, basically, if you're going to do business in here, this is what has to be in here. It's a very, you remember the Spike Lee film?
That's right. Do the right thing.
Do the right thing.
Burn it down.
It's the same mess. I did want to say this, which is something that I've been kind of noodling with since I've been at Howard. There is a constant kind of almost reification of the notion of Howard's extraordinary legacy. And we do need to recognize that legacy. But more important in my judgment is what do we do with the tradition? And the two are not synonymous.
That's right.
And the tradition piece is how do you live it and create it and promote it, the best that comes out of that past, that comes out of that legacy. How do you center that in the day-to-day life and work of the institution? And people, in my judgment, end up claiming the legacy doesn't take very much. You claim the legacy and you say, yeah, they were great, but what the hell are you going to be?
That's right.
And what are you doing? And if what they did was so great, why aren't we emulating it? And you emulate it by keeping that tradition of excellence and critical thinking and taking charge of black people's lives and all. You do it by practicing that, not by simply holding up some pictures of people and saying, oh, he was great, and he was a great sociologist. That don't do it. I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you. In closing, once again, I would like to thank all of the guest panelists.
Thank you.
The four individuals, when I asked the four individuals, I was asking those professors who I knew could give me a real analysis of the intellectual tradition of African studies at Howard. So we're very happy to document that and have that as a part of our Africana collections here at the library. Additionally, I would like to say, particularly to the students who are in the audience, everything that you heard here today, the names that you heard, Leo Hansberry, Kelly Miller, we talked about the African Colonization Society. The papers of the African Colonization Society are here in the Library of Congress. And the entire journal of the Colonization Society, the African Repository, is here in the library. For the African section, we are collecting volumes of data on Africa on a day-to-day basis. These collections need to be used. They need to be interpreted. There's tremendous research to do here at the Library of Congress, as well as in the Morland Spinard collection. So we invite you to take advantage of those collections. Thank you all for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.